Solve this equation, and I'll give you everything in this room. The billionaire's voice cut through the ballroom like shattered glass. Fail, he continued, swirling the amber liquid in his crystal glass, and you're fired before dessert. Silence. The kind of silence that makes people stop chewing. Forks froze halfway to lips. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the soft jazz drifting through the Grand Aurora Hotel seemed to falter. 300 guests turned toward the center stage. Under a chandelier worth more than most homes stood Alexander Kane, 39 years old, founder and CEO of Kane Dynamics. Net worth, $28 billion. In the world of artificial intelligence, Alexander wasn't merely respected. He was feared. Tall, impeccably dressed, with steel gray eyes and the confidence of a man who had never heard the word no, Alexander commanded every room he entered. Tonight was no different. This gala wasn't just another corporate celebration. It was history. Executives, investors, senators, technology pioneers, and international media had gathered in Manhattan for the unveiling of Helios X, an artificial intelligence system expected to redefine modern medicine. A $4 billion partnership depended on its success. But 20 minutes earlier, everything had gone wrong. A massive equation still glowed across the giant LED screen behind Alexander. Lines of code, mathematical symbols, optimization models, error messages. The room's brightest minds had spent nearly an hour trying to solve it. None could. 3 MIT professors had failed. 2 Nobel Prize-winning scientists had failed. Alexander's own research team had failed. And with every passing minute, billions of dollars seemed to slip further away. Frustration darkened Alexander's expression. He hated losing, especially in public. Near the back of the ballroom, moving quietly between tables filled with billionaires and venture capitalists, Naomi Brooks watched everything. Most guests never noticed her. They rarely noticed people carrying trays. At 27, Naomi had mastered invisibility. She moved with calm precision, balancing champagne glasses as effortlessly as breathing. Her uniform was immaculate. Her hair was neatly tied back. Her expression remained composed despite working her second double shift that week. Invisible. That was how the wealthy preferred their servers. Visible only when they needed something. Sweetheart, another sparkling water. Miss, clear this table. Excuse me, you're blocking the view. Naomi had heard it all before. She simply smiled and kept moving. But tonight, something made her stop. She looked again at the equation displayed across the enormous screen. Her eyes narrowed, then widened. She quietly placed her tray on a nearby table. No, that couldn't be right. She stepped closer. The model wasn't failing because the mathematics were impossible. It was failing because of a single assumption buried deep inside the algorithm. One wrong variable. One mistake. Naomi hesitated. Her pulse quickened. This wasn't her world. These people didn't see her as someone with ideas. They saw a waitress. Still, she couldn't ignore it. Not when the answer seemed so obvious. Taking a slow breath, Naomi approached one of the research engineers standing near the stage. "Excuse me," she said softly. "I think the model may be overfitting." The engineer stared. For a second, he looked confused. Then he laughed. A short, dismissive laugh. Unfortunately, Alexander heard it. "So," the billionaire said loudly, turning toward Naomi, "now we're taking technical advice from the waitstaff?" Nervous laughter rippled through the ballroom. Naomi felt hundreds of eyes settle on her. Some curious, some amused, some openly mocking. She should have walked away. Most people would have. But Naomi remained where she was. Calm. Composed. "I only meant," she said carefully, "that your regularization parameter may be incorrectly weighted." The laughter stopped. Alexander raised an eyebrow. Interesting. Not because he believed her. Because she had spoken the language. Perfectly. For the first time all night, the billionaire truly looked at her. "What's your name?" he asked. "Naomi Brooks, sir." Alexander smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of a man preparing to make an example of someone. He turned dramatically toward the crowd. "Well, "Ms. Brooks," he announced, his voice echoing through the ballroom, "if you believe you can solve a problem that defeated the finest minds in America," he pointed toward the giant screen, "then solve it." A murmur swept through the room. Alexander's eyes gleamed. "Solve this equation," he said, "and I'll give you anything you ask for." He paused. "But if you fail, your employment here ends tonight." Gasps rippled through the ballroom. Naomi looked at the stage, then at the audience, then back at the impossible equation. She took a breath and said the 7 words that would change every life in that room. "May I use the board?" Naomi Brooks was not supposed to belong in rooms like this. At least, that was what people kept telling her. Not with words, with looks, with silence, with the subtle way billionaires accepted champagne from her without ever meeting her eyes. The Grand Aurora Hotel sat in the heart of Manhattan like a monument to wealth. Its marble floors reflected crystal chandeliers large enough to illuminate entire neighborhoods. Every evening, the city's elite arrived dressed in custom suits, designer gowns, and the quiet certainty that the world belonged to them. Naomi arrived through the employee entrance. Always. Past the delivery trucks. Past the laundry carts. Past the security door marked staff only. 2 different worlds, separated by only a few hallways. At 27, Naomi had worked at the Grand Aurora for almost 3 years. To most guests, she was simply another server. Another name tag. Another uniform. Another invisible person carrying trays between tables. They never asked questions. They never wondered why a young woman who spoke with such precision worked 12-hour shifts. They never noticed the worn calculus textbook hidden inside her locker, or the notebook she carried everywhere, filled with equations, algorithms, ideas, dreams. Naomi's mornings began long before sunrise. At 5:30 every morning, she woke in a modest apartment in Harlem she shared with her younger brother, Isaiah. Isaiah was 19, brilliant, funny, and confined to a wheelchair after a car accident 2 years earlier. The accident had changed everything. Before that night, Naomi had been pursuing a doctoral degree in applied mathematics at Columbia University. Professors described her as extraordinary. One called her the most gifted mathematical mind I'd encountered in 20 years. Another predicted she would revolutionize artificial intelligence. Then tragedy arrived without warning. A drunk driver. A rainy intersection. One terrible phone call. Their mother died instantly. Isaiah survived. Barely. Medical bills replaced tuition payments. Hospital visits replaced research conferences. And Naomi made a choice. She walked away. Away from academia. Away from her doctoral program. Away from the future she had spent her entire life building. Not because she lacked talent. Because family came first. She never regretted caring for Isaiah. But some nights, after exhausting shifts and unpaid bills, she allowed herself exactly 5 minutes to grieve the life she had lost. Only 5. Then she kept moving. Because survival doesn't wait for heartbreak. Neither did rent. Working at the Grand Aurora wasn't Naomi's dream. It was her sacrifice. Still, she refused to surrender who she was. Every night after work, while most of the city slept, Naomi studied. Public library. Online lectures. Research journals. Second-hand textbooks. Machine learning. Neural networks. Optimization theory. Knowledge became her refuge. Books never judged her accent. Equations never questioned whether she belonged. Numbers only cared whether she was right. And Naomi was often right. Very right. Yet almost no one knew. Not even her coworkers. "Girl, why are you always reading those crazy books?" her friend Jasmine often asked during breaks. Naomi would simply smile. You never know when knowledge might matter. Tonight, standing beneath billion-dollar chandeliers while the most powerful people in America laughed at her, Naomi remembered those words. You never know. Across the ballroom, Alexander Kane still stood on stage. Confident. Amused. Completely certain of the outcome. To him, this was entertainment. A harmless joke. A waitress embarrassing herself in front of Manhattan's elite. The audience seemed to agree. Whispers spread from table to table. Poor girl. Someone should stop this. She's about to lose her job. Several guests had already taken out their phones. Some wanted to record the humiliation. Others simply wanted proof. No one expected a miracle. No one expected history. Near the stage, Naomi looked once more at the glowing equation. Then she quietly removed the white serving gloves from her hands, placed them beside her tray, and began walking toward the platform. Each step echoed through the silent ballroom. For the first time in years, Naomi Brooks was no longer invisible. And before the night ended, neither would her brilliance be. Because sometimes, the people the world overlooks the most are the very ones capable of changing it. Alexander Kane had just challenged a waitress. What he didn't realize was that he had challenged a genius. Alexander Kane did not believe in coincidence. He believed in winners. And losers. Nothing in between. As Naomi Brooks stepped onto the stage, the billionaire watched her with the detached curiosity of a man observing an experiment he already knew the outcome of. The ballroom remained silent. 300 pairs of eyes followed the young waitress as she approached the enormous digital board. Some guests looked uncomfortable. Others looked entertained. A few openly smirked. Alexander noticed all of it. He welcomed it. Humiliation, in his world, was simply another form of education. And tonight, he intended to teach one. "You still have time to walk away," Alexander said, adjusting his cufflinks. "No one will blame you." Polite laughter floated through the room. Naomi met his gaze. "I appreciate your concern," she replied calmly. "But I'd still like to try." Another murmur spread across the ballroom. Alexander studied her. Strange. Most people grew nervous around him. Investors stumbled over their words. Executives rehearsed before meetings. Even politicians carefully measured every sentence. Yet this waitress stood beneath billion-dollar chandeliers with remarkable composure. It irritated him. Alexander Kane had spent his entire life proving one truth: excellence belonged to those willing to sacrifice everything. At 14, he had built his first software platform. At 22, he dropped out of Stanford to launch Kane Dynamics. At 39, he controlled one of the most powerful artificial intelligence companies on Earth. The cost? Almost everything else. Friendships, family, marriage, peace. Success had demanded complete devotion. Alexander paid willingly, because he believed talent was rare, and genius rarer still. That belief had slowly evolved into something darker: arrogance. He no longer simply respected intelligence. He owned it. Or so he thought. "Before we continue," Alexander announced, turning toward the audience, "perhaps our volunteer should understand exactly what she's attempting." The giant screen shifted. A more detailed model appeared. Gasps echoed across the ballroom. The equation wasn't merely complicated. It was monstrous. Thousands of variables. Neural optimization layers. Predictive medical simulations. Enough mathematical complexity to overwhelm most research teams. Professor Samuel Wright from MIT slowly stood. "Mr. Kane," he said carefully, with respect, "this problem required 6 months of collaborative research." The professor glanced toward Naomi. "It would be unfair." Alexander smiled. "Life isn't fair, Professor." Then he looked directly at Naomi. "Neither is business." A few guests applauded. Naomi remained silent. Inside, however, memories surfaced. Lecture halls. Research laboratories. Long nights at Columbia. Pages filled with equations almost identical to these. Because years before becoming a waitress, Naomi had specialized in precisely this field. Medical optimization systems. No one in the ballroom knew. Not yet. Alexander continued. "If Ms. Brooks succeeds, Kane Dynamics will honor my promise." He paused dramatically. "Anything she wants." Excited whispers erupted instantly. $1 million. A house. College tuition. A new life. Everyone had a theory. Alexander raised one hand. "But if she fails?" The room quieted. "She will no longer work at the Grand Aurora." Silence crashed over the ballroom. Naomi felt it immediately. The shift. Moments earlier, This had been entertainment. Now it was survival. Her manager, standing near the back, looked horrified. Mr. Kane, he interrupted nervously. Perhaps that's unnecessary. Alexander cut him off. She accepted the challenge. He turned toward Naomi. Didn't you? Every eye returned to her. Walk away. Protect your job. Protect your family. The thoughts came quickly. Isaiah depended on her. Rent was due in 8 days. One wrong decision could destroy everything. For several seconds, Naomi said nothing. Then she remembered something her mother used to tell her. Never shrink yourself to fit someone else's expectations. Naomi slowly nodded. Yes, she said softly. I accepted. The audience gasped. Alexander smiled. The trap had closed. Or so he believed. He stepped aside, gesturing toward the digital board. Please, he said. Show us what a waitress knows about artificial intelligence. Laughter rippled once more. Naomi walked to the center of the stage. The massive screen glowed before her. Rows of equations stretched endlessly across the display. She studied them quietly. 1 minute passed. Then 2. The audience shifted impatiently. Alexander folded his arms. He had seen enough. But then, Naomi reached for the stylus. And instead of writing an answer, she erased the first line entirely. The ballroom exploded. What is she doing? She just deleted the core equation. Has she lost her mind? Even Professor Wright stood abruptly. Alexander's expression hardened. For the very first time that evening, the billionaire stopped smiling. What is she doing? The whisper came from somewhere near the front row. Then another. She just erased the foundation model. Someone stop her. A wave of disbelief swept through the Grand Aurora Ballroom. 300 guests stared at the giant screen in stunned silence as Naomi Brooks calmly deleted the very equation that had consumed the brightest minds in the room for nearly an hour. Alexander Kane stepped forward instantly. Ms. Brooks, he said, his voice suddenly colder, that equation was developed by a team of 47 researchers. Naomi didn't turn around. I know. The answer was quiet. Respectful. Certain. The billionaire narrowed his eyes. Then perhaps you'd like to explain why you just erased 6 months of research. For the first time that evening, Naomi faced the audience. She looked terrified. Not visibly. Not dramatically. But inside, her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it. She wasn't afraid of mathematics. She was afraid of losing everything. One mistake. One wrong answer. And Isaiah would lose the apartment. One mistake. And the job that kept her family alive would disappear. But then Naomi looked out across the ballroom. She saw executives. Politicians. Investors. People who had already decided who she was before she had spoken a single word. A waitress. Nothing more. Slowly, she exhaled. Then she began. The model isn't failing because the optimization is weak, Naomi said. It's failing because your initial assumption is incorrect. Silence. Absolute silence. Alexander folded his arms. Go on. Naomi tapped the screen. The equation expanded. You designed Helios X to predict surgical complications by treating all patient variables as independent events. Several researchers exchanged glances. She continued. But trauma, chronic illness, genetics, and environmental stress aren't independent. Her hand moved rapidly across the digital board. They're interconnected. Line after line appeared. Elegant. Precise. Confident. Professor Samuel Wright slowly stepped closer to the stage. His expression changed. Then changed again. Naomi continued writing. The model keeps overcompensating because your regularization parameter assumes linear interaction. She circled a section of code. This variable. The room leaned forward. It should never have been positive. A senior engineer frowned. Impossible. Naomi looked directly at him. Run it as negative. The engineer hesitated. Alexander nodded reluctantly. Do it. The engineer entered the change. Nothing happened. For 2 long seconds. Then, the giant screen refreshed. Error messages disappeared. A collective gasp echoed through the ballroom. People stood. Not because they intended to. Because they couldn't help it. The predictive accuracy meter climbed. 81%. 87. 91. 96. Silence crashed over the room. No laughter. No whispers. Only disbelief. Alexander stared at the screen. He looked as though the ground beneath him had vanished. No, one executive whispered. That's impossible. But Professor Wright was already shaking his head. No, he said quietly. It's not impossible. His voice trembled. It's brilliant. He slowly turned toward Naomi. Young lady. He paused. Where did you study? Every eye shifted back to the waitress. Naomi hesitated. For a brief moment, the confident mathematician disappeared. The waitress returned. I attended Columbia, she said softly. A murmur swept through the ballroom. Professor Wright frowned. Attended? Naomi lowered her eyes. I never finished. No one spoke. Alexander studied her carefully. For the first time all evening, he wasn't looking at a waitress. He was looking at a mystery. Because people capable of solving billion-dollar problems did not usually serve champagne. At least, that's what he had always believed. Near the back of the room, several guests had already begun recording. Phones were everywhere now. Something extraordinary was happening. Everyone could feel it. Naomi turned back toward the board. There is one more problem, she said. The room froze. Alexander looked up immediately. What do you mean? Naomi slowly highlighted a second section of the code. Her expression changed. Concern. Real concern. Then she said the words that would bring the entire ballroom to a standstill. If Helios X goes live tomorrow. She paused. Patients could die. The room exploded. The room exploded. What did she just say? Patients could die? Turn that camera off. Voices collided across the ballroom like crashing waves. Executives whispered urgently. Investors exchanged alarmed glances. Several members of Kane Dynamics' board immediately rose from their seats. At the center of it all stood Naomi Brooks. Calm. Still. Completely certain. Alexander Kane stared at her. For the first time in years, the billionaire CEO felt something unfamiliar. Fear. What exactly are you implying, Ms. Brooks? He asked, his voice low and controlled. Naomi turned back toward the giant screen. I'm not implying anything. She highlighted a section of the algorithm. I'm stating a fact. The ballroom fell silent again. Naomi took a breath. Helios X was designed to prioritize predictive speed over contextual accuracy. A senior engineer immediately shook his head. That's impossible. The system was tested across millions of simulations. Naomi nodded. I'm sure it was. She paused. But simulations only reflect the assumptions you give them. She pointed to another line of code. This parameter excludes socioeconomic stress indicators in high-risk patients. Confused murmurs spread through the audience. Naomi continued. Patients from underserved communities often experience delayed diagnoses, chronic stress, limited access to health care, and environmental factors that directly affect surgical outcomes. She looked across the room. If those variables are ignored, the system will consistently underestimate complications in vulnerable populations. Silence. Professor Samuel Wright slowly sat down. His face had gone pale. Naomi's voice remained steady. A patient classified as low risk could actually be high risk. She looked directly at Alexander. And surgeons relying on inaccurate recommendations could make life-threatening decisions. Nobody moved. Nobody even breathed. Then a woman near the front stood abruptly. Dr. Evelyn Ross, Chief Medical Officer for one of the nation's largest hospital networks. Run a retrospective simulation, she said sharply. The engineering team looked toward Alexander. The billionaire hesitated, then nodded. Do it. Within seconds, dozens of fingers flew across keyboards. The ballroom watched in complete silence as historical patient data flowed across the massive screen. 30 seconds. 40. 1 minute. Then the results appeared. Gasps erupted. Projected error rate among affluent patients, 3.2%. Projected error rate among underserved communities, 18.7%. The room froze. 18.7%. Nearly 1 out of every 5 patients. Dr. Ross covered her mouth. My God. An investor slowly lowered his glass. Someone whispered, that could affect thousands of lives. Professor Wright rose once more. This time, his voice trembled. She's right. Complete silence. The words landed like thunder. Alexander felt the blood drain from his face. For 6 months, his company had celebrated Helios X as the future of medicine. Tomorrow morning, it was scheduled for national deployment. Hundreds of hospitals. Millions of patients. And none of his experts had found the flaw. None. A waitress had. No, not a waitress. A scientist. A brilliant scientist hidden behind an apron. Alexander looked at Naomi. Really looked at her. And suddenly, he saw everything he had missed. The confidence. The precision. The restraint. The quiet dignity. How many times had people dismissed her? How many rooms had underestimated her before this one? He didn't know. But he knew one thing. He had just become one of them. A board member suddenly stood. We need to suspend tomorrow's launch immediately. Another executive agreed. The legal exposure alone could destroy us. Forget legal exposure, Dr. Ross interrupted sharply. People could die. The room descended into chaos. Phones rang. Assistants rushed from table to table. Investors whispered frantically. The $4 billion partnership hung by a thread. And at the center of the storm stood Naomi. Silent. Composed. Invisible no longer. Alexander slowly stepped toward her. The ballroom quieted instantly. The billionaire stopped only a few feet away. For several long seconds, he said nothing. Then, in front of 300 witnesses, Alexander Kane did something no one in that room had ever seen him do. He lowered his head and whispered, I owe you an apology. The entire ballroom gasped. But Naomi wasn't looking at him. She was staring at the screen. Because she had just noticed something even more disturbing. There was another hidden anomaly buried deep inside the system. And this one wasn't an accident. The ballroom had barely recovered from the first revelation. Conversations still buzzed in anxious whispers. Investors were already texting legal teams. Board members huddled together in tight circles. And Alexander Kane stood motionless, still trying to process the fact that a waitress had just saved his company from a catastrophic public disaster. Then Naomi spoke again. Mr. Kane. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The entire room fell silent instantly. Naomi pointed toward a section buried deep inside the algorithm. There is something else. Alexander frowned. What do you mean? Naomi zoomed into the code. Thousands of lines flashed across the giant LED display. To most people in the ballroom, it looked like gibberish. But to Naomi, it told a story. And stories always left fingerprints. Her eyes narrowed. This module wasn't written by the same team. Confused murmurs spread through the audience. Alexander looked surprised. That's impossible. Naomi shook her head. No. She highlighted several coding structures. The syntax patterns are different. She circled another section. So are the optimization shortcuts. Professor Samuel Wright stepped closer. His eyes widened. My God. He adjusted his glasses. She's right. The professor turned toward the engineers. Look at the indentation style. The variable naming conventions. Even the annotation structure. One by one, the senior engineers began nodding. Naomi continued. This section was inserted after the primary architecture had already been completed. The room grew quiet. Very quiet. Alexander felt his stomach tighten. Inserted by whom? Naomi hesitated. Only someone with high-level internal access could have done it. Silence. Board members exchanged uneasy glances. A cold realization slowly settled over the ballroom. Someone inside Kane Dynamics had altered Helios X, deliberately. Alexander's voice hardened. Can you prove it? Naomi looked back at the code. Yes. She enlarged another hidden layer. Whoever modified the system created an adaptive bias loop. She pointed at the screen. The flaw appears accidental during routine testing. Several engineers gasped. But once deployed at scale, the algorithm gradually shifts decision weighting. Dr. Evelyn Ross stared at the display. Toward what? Naomi took a breath. Toward premium care facilities. The ballroom erupted. No, that's impossible. Tell me she's wrong. But Naomi wasn't finished. The system systematically favors hospitals with access to expensive diagnostic tools. She looked around the room. Those hospitals happen to belong almost exclusively to one private healthcare network. A deathly silence followed. Alexander slowly turned toward the VIP table reserved for strategic partners. At its center sat Victor Lang, chairman of Medisure Global, one of Kane Dynamics' largest investors, and the company expected to profit most from Helios X's national rollout. Victor's face had turned completely white. Professor Wright whispered, "This isn't bias." Dr. Ross finished the sentence. "It's market manipulation." Shock rippled through the ballroom. If true, the implications were devastating. Fraud, medical discrimination, corporate sabotage, potential criminal charges. Alexander's jaw tightened. He looked directly at Victor. "You had access to our development servers." Victor immediately stood. "This is absurd." His voice cracked. "You can't seriously believe a waitress over your own partners." Naomi remained calm. "I don't need anyone to believe me." She tapped one final command. A timestamp appeared on the giant screen. Then another. Then a complete audit trail. Every modification. Every access point. Every digital signature. The ballroom froze. One name appeared repeatedly. Victor Lang. The room exploded. Journalists rushed forward. Phones shot into the air. Board members shouted over one another. Security personnel moved toward Victor immediately. "Wait," Victor yelled. "You don't understand." "No," Alexander interrupted. His voice was colder than anyone had ever heard. "You don't understand." The billionaire stepped forward. For years, Alexander Kane had ruled boardrooms through intimidation. Tonight, there was no anger in his eyes. Only disappointment. "You nearly turned innovation into exploitation." Victor opened his mouth. No words came, because there was nothing left to say. Security escorted him from the ballroom as hundreds of guests watched in stunned silence. And still, Naomi remained standing quietly beside the screen. She hadn't exposed a flaw. She had exposed corruption. Alexander looked at her. This time, not as a billionaire looking at an employee. Not as a CEO looking at a waitress. But as one extraordinary mind recognizing another. Then he asked the question that would change Naomi's life forever. "Who are you really?" And for the first time that night, Naomi smiled. "Who are you really?" Alexander Kane's question lingered in the air. The ballroom fell silent once again. 300 people waited. Journalists lowered their microphones. Investors stopped whispering. Even the hotel staff standing near the service entrance had forgotten they were still on duty. Everyone was looking at Naomi Brooks, the waitress. The woman who had just saved a $4 billion partnership, exposed corporate corruption, and uncovered flaws that an entire team of elite scientists had somehow missed. Naomi looked down at the white serving gloves resting beside the podium. For a moment, she said nothing. Then she smiled softly. "A waitress," she answered. A few people laughed nervously. Alexander didn't. "No," he said quietly. "You're much more than that." Naomi hesitated. She had spent years hiding. Years making herself smaller. Safer. Invisible. But tonight, invisibility was no longer possible. Slowly, she turned toward the audience. "My name is Naomi Brooks," she began. 7 years ago, I was a doctoral candidate in applied mathematics at Columbia University. The room stirred. Professor Samuel Wright froze. "Columbia," he repeated. Naomi nodded. "I specialized in machine learning models for predictive healthcare systems." Gasps echoed across the ballroom. One of the reporters immediately began typing. Another lifted a camera. Naomi continued. "My research focused on eliminating bias in medical AI." Alexander's expression changed instantly. Bias. Of course. That explained everything. She hadn't simply recognized the flaw. She had dedicated her life to studying it. Professor Wright suddenly stepped forward. "Wait." His voice trembled. "What was the title of your dissertation proposal?" Naomi looked surprised. Adaptive equity modeling in clinical prediction systems. The elderly professor stared at her. For several seconds, he couldn't speak. Finally, he whispered, "My God." The room waited. Professor Wright slowly removed his glasses. I reviewed that proposal. Complete silence. It was the most extraordinary piece of graduate research I had seen in 28 years. A collective gasp swept through the ballroom. Alexander looked stunned. If it was that remarkable, he asked quietly, "Why didn't you finish?" Naomi's smile faded. For the first time all evening, pain crossed her face. Because life happened. Silence. My mother died unexpectedly. She paused. My younger brother was severely injured in a car accident 3 weeks later. The ballroom grew still. I became his guardian. No one moved. No one even looked away. Medical bills replaced tuition. Naomi's voice remained calm. Eventually, I had to choose. Her eyes glistened. Research or family? She took a slow breath. I chose family. Several guests lowered their heads. One woman quietly wiped away tears. Naomi smiled again. Not sadly. Proudly. I don't regret it. Near the back of the room, hotel employees stood shoulder to shoulder. Some were crying openly. Because they knew Naomi. The woman who covered extra shifts without complaint. Who brought homemade soup when someone was sick. Who stayed late to help new employees. And yet none of them had known. None had realized they had been working beside a genius. Alexander felt something tighten in his chest. Shame. Real shame. Hours earlier, he had reduced this woman to a stereotype. A uniform. A joke. Now he understood. The problem had never been Naomi's position. The problem had been his assumptions. A young journalist finally raised her hand. "Ms. Brooks," she asked softly, "after everything you've sacrificed, do you ever feel angry?" Naomi considered the question. Then she answered. "Sometimes." The ballroom remained perfectly silent. But anger can only carry you so far. She looked around the room. Knowledge carried me further. Another pause. And dignity carried me through the rest. No one applauded. Not immediately. The moment felt too important. Too human. Then, slowly, Professor Samuel Wright began clapping. One pair of hands. Then another. Then another. Within seconds, the entire ballroom rose to its feet. A standing ovation. Not for a waitress. Not for a mathematician. But for a woman who had refused to surrender her brilliance, even when the world stopped looking for it. Alexander remained standing long after the applause faded. Because deep down, he knew. Something extraordinary had happened that night. And he wasn't about to let Naomi Brooks disappear again. Not ever. But neither of them realized that by sunrise, Naomi's story would no longer belong to this ballroom. It would belong to the entire world. Who are you really? Alexander Kane's question lingered in the air. The ballroom fell silent once again. 300 people waited. Journalists lowered their microphones. Investors stopped whispering. Even the hotel staff standing near the service entrance had forgotten they were still on duty. Everyone was looking at Naomi Brooks, the waitress. The woman who had just saved a $4 billion partnership. Exposed corporate corruption. And uncovered flaws that an entire team of elite scientists had somehow missed. Naomi looked down at the white serving gloves resting beside the podium. For a moment, she said nothing. Then she smiled softly. "A waitress," she answered. A few people laughed nervously. Alexander didn't. "No," he said quietly. "You're much more than that." Naomi hesitated. She had spent years hiding. Years making herself smaller. Safer. Invisible. But tonight, invisibility was no longer possible. Slowly, she turned toward the audience. "My name is Naomi Brooks," she began. 7 years ago, I was a doctoral candidate in applied mathematics at Columbia University. The room stirred. Professor Samuel Wright froze. "Columbia," he repeated. Naomi nodded. "I specialized in machine learning models for predictive healthcare systems." Gasps echoed across the ballroom. One of the reporters immediately began typing. Another lifted a camera. Naomi continued. "My research focused on eliminating bias in medical AI." Alexander's expression changed instantly. Bias. Of course. That explained everything. She hadn't simply recognized the flaw. She had dedicated her life to studying it. Professor Wright suddenly stepped forward. Wait. His voice trembled. What was the title of your dissertation proposal? Naomi looked surprised. Adaptive Equity Modeling in Clinical Prediction Systems. The elderly professor stared at her. For several seconds, he couldn't speak. Finally, he whispered, "My God." The room waited. Professor Wright slowly removed his glasses. I reviewed that proposal. Complete silence. It was the most extraordinary piece of graduate research I had seen in 28 years. A collective gasp swept through the ballroom. Alexander looked stunned. If it was that remarkable, he asked quietly, "Why didn't you finish?" Naomi's smile faded. For the first time all evening, pain crossed her face. Because life happened. Silence. My mother died unexpectedly. She paused. My younger brother was severely injured in a car accident 3 weeks later. The ballroom grew still. I became his guardian. No one moved. No one even looked away. Medical bills replaced tuition. Naomi's voice remained calm. Eventually, I had to choose. Her eyes glistened. Research or family? She took a slow breath. I chose family. Several guests lowered their heads. One woman quietly wiped away tears. Naomi smiled again. Not sadly. Proudly. I don't regret it. Near the back of the room, hotel employees stood shoulder to shoulder. Some were crying openly. Because they knew Naomi. The woman who covered extra shifts without complaint. Who brought homemade soup when someone was sick. Who stayed late to help new employees. And yet none of them had known. None had realized they had been working beside a genius. Alexander felt something tighten in his chest. Shame. Real shame. Hours earlier, he had reduced this woman to a stereotype. A uniform. A joke. Now he understood. The problem had never been Naomi's position. The problem had been his assumptions. A young journalist finally raised her hand. "Ms. Brooks," she asked softly, "after everything you've sacrificed, do you ever feel angry?" Naomi considered the question. Then she answered. Sometimes. The ballroom remained perfectly silent. But anger can only carry you so far. She looked around the room. Knowledge carried me further. Another pause. And dignity carried me through the rest. No one applauded. Not immediately. The moment felt too important. Too human. Then, slowly, Professor Samuel Wright began clapping. One pair of hands. Then another. Then another. Within seconds, the entire ballroom rose to its feet. A standing ovation. Not for a waitress. Not for a mathematician. But for a woman who had refused to surrender her brilliance, even when the world stopped looking for it. Alexander remained standing long after the applause faded. Because deep down, he knew something extraordinary had happened that night. And he wasn't about to let Naomi Brooks disappear again. Not ever. But neither of them realized that by sunrise, Naomi's story would no longer belong to this ballroom. It would belong to the entire world. By sunrise, Naomi Brooks was no longer invisible. She was everywhere. The first video appeared online at 11:47 p.m. A shaky 30-second clip recorded by an investment analyst seated near the front row. It showed a young black waitress standing beneath a billion-dollar chandelier, calmly correcting one of the world's most powerful technology CEOs. By midnight, the video had surpassed 1 million views. By dawn, it had crossed 20 million. And it was still climbing. Headlines exploded across the internet. Waitress exposes flaw in billion-dollar AI system. Unknown hotel server saves thousands of future patients. The genius in an apron. Who is Naomi Brooks? Social media did what social media always does. It chose a side. And this time, the world chose Naomi. People shared stories of being overlooked. Teachers wrote about former students forced to abandon college because of family hardship. Single mothers called Naomi an inspiration. Doctors praised her courage. Researchers demanded universities bring her back. One hashtag quickly dominated every platform. Hashtag the waitress who saved lives inside the modest Harlem apartment she shared with Isaiah, Naomi stared in disbelief at the television screen. Every news channel carried her story. She looked exhausted, overwhelmed, terrified. Isaiah, sitting beside her in his wheelchair, simply smiled. "I told you someday the world would notice." Naomi laughed softly. "I was hoping for something a little quieter." Before Isaiah could answer, her phone rang. Unknown number. Naomi hesitated, then answered. "Hello, Ms. Brooks." The voice sounded familiar. "Alexander Kane." Naomi straightened immediately. "Mr. Kane, I owe you much more than an apology," Alexander said. There was no arrogance in his voice. No performance. Only sincerity. "I'd like to meet." Naomi considered declining. Part of her still remembered standing in that ballroom while people laughed. Part of her remembered the humiliation. But another part remembered something else. People could change. "All right," she said. "One meeting." 2 hours later, a black car stopped outside her apartment building. The neighborhood noticed immediately. Luxury. Vehicles rarely visited that part of Harlem. Alexander stepped out alone. No assistants. No security team. No cameras. Just a man carrying a simple leather folder. When Naomi opened the door, neither spoke for several seconds. Finally, Alexander said the words no one at Kane Dynamics had ever heard him say. "I was wrong." Naomi said nothing. Alexander continued. "I judged your circumstances." He paused. "And because of that, I almost ignored one of the greatest minds I've ever encountered." The billionaire looked genuinely uncomfortable, as though humility was a language he had only recently begun learning. Naomi crossed her arms. "Why are you here, Mr. Kane?" Alexander handed her the folder. Inside were documents. Research grants. Medical coverage for Isaiah. Housing assistance. And one final page. A formal employment offer. Senior Director of Ethical AI Research. Annual salary, $3 million. Naomi looked up immediately. "I can't accept charity." Alexander shook his head. "This isn't charity." He smiled softly. "It's the market finally catching up to your value." Silence filled the apartment. Isaiah quietly watched from across the room. Alexander continued. "Kane Dynamics needs someone willing to challenge powerful people." He paused. "Especially me." Naomi looked down at the offer again. $3 million. Enough to change everything. Enough to secure Isaiah's future. Enough to return to the research she had loved. But money wasn't the reason she hesitated. Respect was. She looked directly at Alexander. "If I join your company, I will disagree with you." Alexander nodded. "I expect you to." "I won't stay silent when something is wrong." "I know. I won't let profits come before people." For the first time, Alexander smiled. "A few days ago, that answer might have bothered me." He extended his hand. "Today, it's exactly why I'm here." Naomi looked at his hand, then slowly shook it. Outside the apartment window, cameras had already begun gathering. The world believed this was the end of Naomi Brooks' story. In truth, it was only the beginning. Because 3 months later, Naomi would walk into Kane Dynamics headquarters for the first time. And discover that not everyone inside the company wanted her there. 3 months later, Naomi Brooks walked through the glass doors of Kane Dynamics headquarters. This time, she wasn't carrying a tray. She was carrying a laptop. And a vision. The lobby fell silent. Employees stopped mid-conversation. Some recognized her immediately. The waitress. The woman from the viral video. The genius who had exposed corruption, saved a billion-dollar company, and become one of the most talked-about figures in America. But admiration wasn't universal. Not everyone was happy to see her. Especially those who believed she hadn't earned her place. By noon, whispers had already spread through the executive floors. "She's only here because of the publicity." Alexander hired her out of guilt. One lucky moment doesn't make someone a leader. Naomi heard none of it. And even if she had, she wouldn't have answered. She had spent too many years being underestimated. She no longer needed to defend her existence. Instead, she worked. Quietly. Relentlessly. Within weeks, Naomi assembled a new research division dedicated to ethical artificial intelligence. Her mission was simple: build technology that served everyone, not just those who could afford it. She recruited diverse researchers, engineers from overlooked communities, young scientists whose ideas had been ignored, brilliant minds hidden in ordinary places, people much like herself. Resistance came quickly. One senior executive openly challenged her during a board meeting. With respect, he said, "We're a technology company, not a charity." The room grew tense. All eyes turned toward Naomi. She calmly closed her notebook. Then she spoke. "Ethics is not charity." Silence. "It's responsibility." She looked around the boardroom. "Technology without humanity isn't innovation." She paused. "It's negligence." No one argued. Not even Alexander. Especially not Alexander. Because over those months, the billionaire had changed. The transformation wasn't dramatic. It was quieter than that. He started learning employees' names. He listened more. Interrupted less. He visited research labs instead of simply reading reports. And every Friday morning, he attended Naomi's ethics review meetings. Not as CEO. As a student. One evening, long after most employees had gone home, Alexander found Naomi standing alone inside the company's innovation center. She was watching a group of high school students touring the facility. Many came from underfunded neighborhoods. Several had never visited a technology company before. One young girl stared at the robotics lab in complete awe. "Do you see yourself in her?" Alexander asked quietly. Naomi smiled. "No." Alexander looked surprised. "No?" Naomi shook her head. "I see someone who won't have to struggle the way I did." She looked through the glass. And that's enough. Months later, Kane Dynamics announced the launch of the Brooks Initiative, a nationwide scholarship and mentorship program for students from underserved communities pursuing science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. The first donation came from Alexander Kane, $100 million. But Naomi insisted on one condition. Every scholarship recipient would be chosen anonymously. No names. No photographs. No family income labels. Only talent. Only potential. Because genius doesn't always wear a suit. Sometimes it wears an apron. 1 year after that unforgettable night at the Grand Aurora Hotel, Naomi returned. Not as staff. As keynote speaker. The same ballroom shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers. Many of the guests were familiar. Investors. Executives. Politicians. But something had changed. When Naomi entered the room, everyone stood. Not because of her title. Not because of her fame. Because of her character. Near the back of the ballroom stood Alexander. Watching quietly. Just as Naomi had once watched everyone else. When the applause faded, Naomi stepped to the podium. She looked across the room. Then she said, "A year ago, many people in this room saw a waitress." She paused. "Tonight, I hope you see something else." Silence. A reminder. Her voice softened. Never confuse someone's circumstances with their worth. The ballroom rose in a standing ovation. And somewhere, beyond the cameras, beyond the headlines, beyond the billions, a mother who had raised her daughter to choose dignity over bitterness would have been proud. Because this was never a story about money. It was never a story about power. It was a story about human worth. About grace. About courage. About the quiet brilliance the world so often overlooks. And on that unforgettable night, the arrogant billionaire offered everything if she solved it. She did. But in the end, she gave the room something far more valuable. Perspective. Because power means nothing without grace. And dignity needs no permission.